Hello and welcome to episode 21 at the House of Dissent podcast. In this episode, I'll be reading from chapter 8 from the book The Internet and Radical Voices of Dissent that I published in 2025. And this chapter is called Colombian Resistance in Civil Society, and it's written by Valentina Murillo. My mother once told me a story when I was young about how the earth is fragile and how it needs to be protected. I recall asking, "Who does it need protecting from, Mama?" And she replied, "From us." I was 9 years old and I didn't really understand what she had meant by us because we had no intention to harm the environment. But as I grew older, I realized that us meant all humans. I asked Mama why humans would want to harm the earth. She told me that I would have to discover the answer for myself, and that is what I did. And when I discovered the answer, I was shocked. But there is no more shock, just anger, and everyone on our fragile earth knows who the villains are in this story of humanity, and the decimation and plunder of our land for profit. Humans have commercialized nature, turning it into a means to produce fast profits for multinational companies that create wealth discrepancies in the country they reside, far away from the countries they have systematically abused and raped. The biggest villain in modern times by far is the Disunited States of America, not a real country but rather a corporate business. In the Disunited States of America, the richest country on our shared earth, the gulf between the rich and the poor is as vast as the Antarctic polar desert, the largest on Earth. The ghosts that wander the polar desert tell people stories of the emptiness of the space they occupy. They say the polar desert is a secular purgatory in which they tell and retell the same story over and over again about the plunder of our Earth. I often wonder if I have anything in common with the poor Americans that exist in unhealthy levels of poverty, many living in tents on the streets, drug-induced in a zombie state. It's ironic, really, because although my country, Colombia, has been plundered, nature smashed to bits, it is the gringos who also suffer from the greed of their so-called fellow Americans and the consequences of greed in their country. The rich Americans have no attachment to nature and live sad, isolated, alienated lives from others. Many Americans have guns to prove they trust nobody. When the white Americans committed near genocide of the American indigenous, they simultaneously lost every connection with nature. But the detachment from nature is not limited to the Disunited States of America. It is far more widespread, affecting different classes and strata in Western societies, in what Vandana Shiva called eco-apartheid, where the human mind is separate from nature. Even the poorest suffer from this psychological condition as they enter the supermarket to purchase cuts of meat that fit perfectly into the packaging they are sold. A gringo once told me that even the fruit they buy must have no imperfections on them, the potatoes not too wobbly looking, carrots perfectly shaped, and so on, otherwise people won't buy them. Eco-apartheid is endemic in Western systems with their obsession with perfect fruit and vegetables, which has a knock-on effect for the producers, whose wobbly fruit and vegetables are classified not fit for human consumption. The most influential book I have read that changed my whole way of thinking was Biopiracy, The Plunder of Nature and Knowledge by Vandana Shiva. It was Vandana's book that made me realize that Colombia was just a small part of something far more problematic and larger than I ever could have imagined. Moreover, the book spoke to me as a part Spanish descendant in Colombia, with passages in the book referring to the Spanish conquest of the Americas. Those passages stopped me in my tracks and continue to haunt me to this day, because I had to look myself in the mirror and think about what generations of Spaniards had inflicted upon the environment. I hadn't thought about this too deeply. I, like other citizens, only thought about the land grab, the slavery, exploitation and barbarity imposed upon the indigenous people of the Americas. Not for one moment did I think about biopiracy and the theft of seeds and the beginning of patents that Spaniards would eventually claim those seeds as theirs. The section of the book which deeply affected me the most was the reference to 1492, when, as Vandana says, Queen Isabel and King Ferdinand granted Christopher Columbus the privileges of discovery and conquest. The Spaniards created a charter for Columbus called the Papal Bull that would change the course of history in the Americas for the worst, and this was because, as Vandana says, patents granted by European monarchs laid the juridical and moral foundations for the colonization and extermination of non-European peoples. The Native American population declined from 72 million in 1492 to less than 4 million a few centuries later. It was the charter and patents that would be the source of the piracy and theft that Vandana Shiva was highlighting in her book. The biopiracy inflicted great harm upon a land and its peoples by a cruel and barbaric colonial power. But it is important to know that Vandana placed the plunder of a foreign land by the Spanish in its proper context, and the rationale for the Spaniards was their belief in Christianity. She said that the charter was in fact the expression of a divine will. I call it an act of religious zealots and fanatics who, in the same year 1492, were instituting pogroms against Jews and Muslims in their own countries as the Christians sought to control Spain through religious autocracy. However disgraceful and cruel the Spaniards were, the piracy and theft was only the beginning. As Vandana says, 500 years after Columbus, a more secular version of the same project of colonization continues through patents and intellectual property rights. The Papal Bull has been replaced by the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade Treaty, known as GATT. The principle of effective occupation by Christian princes has been replaced by effective occupation by the transnational corporations supported by modern-day rulers. The GATT Treaty was created in post-World War II Europe in 1947 and was dominated by the Americans and British. And the raison d'etre for its inclusion in the global economics was to guarantee the liberalization of international trade. The GATT Treaty was replaced by the World Trade Organization, WTO, in 1995, and Colombia joined in April that same fateful year without consulting the indigenous groups. Many of the tribes continue to retain a deep spiritual connection with nature, but for them it is the outsiders, the non-indigenous, who need to reconnect with nature to halt the continued plunder and piracy of the land on which they require for survival. Many non-indigenous are trying to retrieve that connection because they realize that capitalism is causing the 6th mass extinction on Earth, and that before we can halt it, many millions of people will be displaced because of the rising global temperatures. Then mass migration will continue to increase, leading to a rise in far-right-wing nationalist ideology in Western societies as groups try to halt foreigners entering rich countries. Many millions will die because of reduced water availability, increase in arid landscapes and the eventual collapse of ecosystems, biodiversity, oceans so warm that cold sea creatures will simply die, leading to a vast reduction in seafood. The Chinese will increase the size of its ever-increasing and obscene fishing vessels as it mass trawls and plunders the seas in ever more intensity as stocks diminish to feed their people. They will even come to the shores of the Americas time and time again to satisfy their ever-growing consumer demand. Insects are also disappearing at an alarming rate, bees and butterflies dwindling, birds migrating less because their food source is no longer available in their migratory ancestral lands. Animals that are normally vegetarian are today forced to eat meat because the vegetables refuse to grow, and animals committing acts of cannibalism to survive. And so, as Oscar Montero says, the message to the world, to humanity, is that we cannot have peace but we are in peace with Mother Earth. And peace comes in many shapes and sizes, and I want to discuss peace in relation to the violence that indigenous people of Colombia have had to confront for so long in their history. The Minga, a collective group of various indigenous groups, have joined forces in their respective struggle for their land, environment, preservation of language and culture, and social justice. The context of their story is that it is one amongst many others in the fight to save nature, to halt climate disaster, and to think about a different way of living with and in tune with nature. There are many similar stories, and the Minga, like indigenous groups all over the Americas, believe each struggle is one tiny part of the scale of humanity's fight for global climate and environmental justice that will halt the sixth mass extinction. This collective struggle, both within and outside of Colombia, is made possible today by the way the indigenous have embraced the internet, social media, and uploading videos to show how other indigenous they are not alone in this global struggle to save nature. It is important to stress that the Minga are a social movement because a social movement has very interesting characteristics and objectives. This means it isn't just a protest movement. It means that they share an ideological view of processes and outcomes in their collective struggle for justice and rights. The Minga has a presence online, and like other indigenous throughout the Americas, they use it as a weapon of resistance and struggle for self-recognition, promoting culture, language, and politics. Their website is Asociación Minga, where you can read about their stories with links to social media accounts such as Facebook and X. I found a document there called About Social Participation in Public Policies of Change, which is defining what they mean by creating a social movement. And they say this: if we wanted to define a social process as radically alternative, one of those fundamental criteria would be participation. The harmonization and development of cultures, social and environmental coexistence, which is, after all, the essence of politics, depends on it. There are groups the Minga Association has worked alongside to promote a sense of solidarity and to help. One group is the Committee for Social Integration in Catatumbo, known as CISCA, and there is an article called Catatumbo Faces of Resistance on their website. It details the struggle against violence in the Catatumbo region, which has been ravaged by the armed conflict between the National Liberation Army, the ELN, and the Popular Liberation Army, the EPL. CISCA works on behalf of the campesino communities of Catatumbo who have been subjected to the worst kinds of violence imaginable, and they suffer from extreme levels of poverty. In November 2023, Amnesty International produced a document called Colombia Hope at Risk. The lack of a safe space to defend human rights in Colombia continues, that details the continued use of violence in Catatumbo. In the document, there is an extract from an interview with Maria Quiro, who is a member of CISCA, and it was given in February 2023, which revealed CISCA's passionate concerns about nature and environment. And Maria said that they have zero trust in the state. And she says this because it fails to take proper care of nature and does not consider campesino farmers as partners in the fight against climate change. Because the area is fully militarized, this means that there is, as Maria says, no safe space for anyone, least of all for human rights defenders, which is coupled with a lack of investment to replenish and protect the land. But it is important to note that the document produced by Amnesty does acknowledge progress under Gustavo Petro's government, with a reduction of stigmatization towards human rights workers, thus reducing risk for CISCA. However, despite this, in September 2023, the Minga marched to Bogotá, the capital of Colombia, to voice their anger at the high levels of violence committed against them and on their land. This was a significant peaceful demonstration because it was the first time the Minga had staged one which was critical of the new left-wing leadership of President Gustavo Petro, because life for the Minga was meant to get significantly better under his presidency, but at the time it hadn't happened. I witnessed the march, which had so many different indigenous in attendance, one of which came a long distance from the Cauca Valley, which is in the southern western side of Colombia. It is the home to the Nasa people, also known as Payés. It's home also to the Guambiano, the Coconuco, and other indigenous groups. The capital is Popayan, which is a 3-hour drive south of Cali and a 10-hour drive or 6 days walk to Bogotá, where the demonstration was held. There is a pre-Hispanic pyramid in Popayan called El Toro del Tucán, which is so old that it was abandoned before the invading Spanish arrived. The conquistadors, led by Sebastián de Belalcázar, imposed a system of slavery, forcing the indigenous to labor for gold and silver, which the Spanish and Portuguese minted into coins. Both the Nasa and Guambiano languages are related to the Chibcha linguistic branch, and the pre-Columbian culture they belong to is called Tierra Dentro because of the underground tombs that are scattered across the region. The violence in the Cauca Valley between state military forces and guerrilla forces has existed for the past 60 years. The Nasa have been protesting this violence that has scarred their lives and courageously defend their land and human rights in the process. In 1971, they formed the Regional Indigenous Council of Cauca, all known as CRIC, in the town of Toribio, which has been at the centre of the armed conflict. Toribio is northeast of the capital Popayan. CRIC's main aim is to defend their ancestral lands, and one striking provision in their manifesto is the defence of their culture, traditions and language. Nasa people who demonstrated in Bogotá were explaining how they had taken back parts of their ancestral lands and how they have cared for it by replanting trees and growing crops and fruit trees to feed the community. They told me that their cattle and pigs are carefully reared. It's what Westerners call grass-fed outdoor meat. But that's how it has been before the Nasa land was confiscated from them. The system of collectivized labor guarantees that their ancestral lands will be protected against private, commercialized interests, but it is always a struggle for them to defend against wealthy, powerful corporate interests. This is the reason that the Nasa also set up the Guardia Indígena del Cauca to defend their ancestral land and their way of life. On the Frontline Defenders website, FLD, they tell the world, the Indigenous Guard of Cauca is a community protection network made up of women, men, boys, and girls who defend their territories peacefully, and that it is a part of the Association of Indigenous Councils of the North of Cauca, known as ACHIN. Most of the members belong to the Nasa people, the indigenous group, and one of their main objectives is to protect their autonomy and ancestral lands from those who seek territorial control. Since 2001, the Indigenous Guard of Cauca has trained other communities to defend their own territories. According to Global Witness, Colombia has the second highest rate of murders against human rights defenders, journalists and activists. Incredibly, and despite the extreme forms of violence the Nasa people have had to endure, the protection network is not armed with military hardware, but only the tools of their labor from the fields they love and protect. There are other organizations other than the FLD who help the indigenous in Colombia and beyond. One is the Forest Peoples Programme, the FPP, based in the United Kingdom and Holland. And on the FPP's website, it says, forests are owned and controlled by forest peoples in ways that ensure sustainable livelihoods, equity and well-being based on respect for their rights, knowledge, cultures, and identities. Forest People's Programme supports the right of people who live in forests and depend on them for their livelihoods. We work to create political space for forest peoples to secure their rights, control their lands and decide their own futures. The Nasa are a brave and tenacious people, and they use social media wisely as a weapon of dissent against the state, armed groups and moreover against the economic rationale of capitalism. Their website, Proceso de Liberación de la Madre Tierra, is extremely impressive, with a multimedia and educational approach to the issues that concern the Nasa. At the center of their struggle is the fight to protect Umakiwe, Pachamama or Mother Earth against corporate commercial interests. And they say this on their website. We are communities of the Nasa people of Northern Cauca, Colombia, who since 2005 have risen up against the capitalist power that enslaves Mother Earth. Our mother is not free for life, which she will be when she once again becomes the soil and collective home of the peoples who care for her, respect her, and live with her, and as long as this is not the case, her children are not free either. All peoples are slaves along with the animals and the beings of life, if we do not get our mother to regain her freedom. The Nasa refer to capitalism as a monster, and they explain how their fight to save Pachamama is based on the eventual defeat of capitalism and create a different way of living. And they say another world already exists. On their website is the most remarkable and engaging videos that is divided into 2 episodes called Who Are the Invaders?, which are truly extraordinary to watch. The videos use puppetry to explain the history of Mother Earth, those who invaded their land, and an explanation of how their land was transformed into a monoculture of sugar plantations. Some parts of the video are satirical, that both details and mocks the Pope and King of Spain in the 15th century, when they decided to colonize Nasa land. This is extremely engaging to watch because satire is such a powerful cultural weapon that poor people use throughout the Americas to criticize the invaders through mockery. 3 invading figures that feature in the video are Pope Alexander IV, King Ferdinand of Spain, and a conquistador. The 3 are gloriously presented as grotesque caricatures. The Pope is particularly ugly, presented with large oversized ears, with a large pig-like snout. Thomas Mann once called the combination of satire with the grotesque as the genuine anti-bourgeois style of representation. There is more than the carnivalesque about the representations in the Nasa videos, the type that the Russian writer Mikhail Bakhtin discussed in his wonderful book, Rabelais and His World, where the author argued that carnival was a collective social enterprise, where there is a deep sense of equality about the act and process of carnival. Bakhtin also informed us of another creative form manufactured by the collective, which he called is a grotesque realism, which entails wearing masks that are caricatures of the subject that they are directed towards. The caricatures presented by the Nasa in their video is literally the grotesque exaggeration of the Pope, the King of Spain, and the Conquistador, which not only mocks them but is designed to offend and undermine their authority, which is why wherever one finds it, satirizing those in power is an act of glorious subversion and resistance. In the video, the Pope declares that God has spoken, and he, the Almighty, allows the King of Spain to take possession of everything. The Pope then hands the King the cross of the Catholic Church, which doubles as a dagger, in which the King plunges violently into the land they claimed for themselves as a sign of Catholic and royal possession. The videos are also an unrelenting assault on capitalism, and how, as an economic system, it has almost destroyed the social system of the Nasa. I say almost because the NASA's collective dissenting voice and actions are proof of how resistance can be successful for surviving, despite everything that has been thrown their way. A section of the videos is right out of the playbook of the 17th century English philosopher John Locke, the so-called father of liberalism, who was the first to write that land could be privately owned and divided up for production purposes. Liberalism is the dogma that argues that individual rights are an intrinsic part of human nature and therefore God ordains it so. NASA quite rightly reject this ideology, and the intoxicating videos end by stating that the struggle continues to protect their land, crops, animals, their preferred way of living, and Mother Earth. Colombia is a country of ethnic contrasts, and alongside the indigenous are the Afro Colombian communities, brought to my country through the Spanish slave trade. Yes, it is true that the Spaniards brutalized the indigenous, brought their vile form of Christianity to this land, imposed their cultural values and language, enslaved Africans, forced them from their homeland, brought them to Colombia, and created their cruel and exploitative system from their labor. Many black slaves bravely rebelled and fled from their Spanish slave owners. They are known as the Maroons. In Spanish they are called Cimarron. In the Caribbean, they were the Coromantee, the people from Ghana, from the Akan people of the Asante Empire. They were viewed as troublesome for good reason, because they dissented, resisted, and fought their slave masters for freedom. In Colombia today, the group called the Black Communities Process, or the PCN, promotes the emancipation of the black people of Colombia. Their website is titled Revenant, meaning one that has returned from death. And they tell the world this: we are a dynamic black organization that brings together more than 140 grassroots organizations, community councils and people who constantly work on the transformation of the political, social, economic and territorial reality of black, Afro-descendant, Rizal and Palenquera communities through defense and vindication of their individual, collective and ancestral rights. The PCN have social media presence on Facebook, where they stress the importance of a people-centered approach to community conservation. Like the NASA, the PCN use their internet presence as an educational tool by using cartoon images that children can easily identify with. And like the NASA, the PCN operate peacefully by utilizing their internet presence within civil society. This process cannot be underestimated, given the violence that Colombia has suffered from for so long, and yes, beginning as far back as the Spanish invasion in 1492. Directly west from Toribio, across Highway 25, is the cocoa town of Yolombo, which is the birthplace of the environmental activist Francia Elena Marquez Mina. Marquez is the leader of Soy Porque Somos, otherwise known as I Am Because We Are, and she is the current Vice President of Colombia. She is also a lawyer, and her story is remarkable. Soy Porque Somos is taken as the Spanish translation from Ubuntu in South Africa, which is the foundation of its philosophy regarding the interconnectedness of people. Soy Porque Somos is a young political party formed in 2021 from the Afro Colombian community and is a part of the historic Pact of Colombia, which includes Gustavo Petro, the leader of the Humane Colombia Party and the current president of Colombia. Born as a black woman into extreme poverty, Francia Marquez rose up to resist her position and the collective position of Afro-Colombians at the tender age of 15. The Humane Colombia Party has emerged out of a long struggle for electoral democracy that was led by the 19th of April movement, otherwise known as M19. One of the most important leaders in M19 was the charismatic Carlos Pizarro Leon Gomez, who oversaw the demobilization of the group and who had created a new political party, the M19 Democratic Alliance. Pizarro Leon Gomez was assassinated in 1990 by a right-wing paramilitary member. But his legacy in Colombia will not be forgotten as the former guerrilla leader that sought peace and helped to create a wider democratic system that we have today in Colombia. Earlier, I mentioned that it takes 10 days to walk from a part of the Coco Valley to Bogotá. In 2014, Francia and other women organized a march from the village of La Toma to Bogotá in 2014, which is 350 kilometers in length. They called this La Marcha de los Turbantes, or the March of the Turbans, because the women wanted to express their African origins by wearing the traditional headwear. There were 70 women who began that historical march, and it reminds me of a similar march that took place in England in 1936. 200 men walked 282 miles from Jarrow in the north of England to London. It was called the Jarrow Crusade, and it took those brave men 26 days to walk to protest unemployment. Another group, the National Cimarron Movement, or NCM, was established in 1982 and campaigns to defend human rights and promote education for the Afro Colombian communities. The NCM also promotes a healthy political agenda and submits documents on public policy issues, some of which are in relation to the atrocious forms of racism the Afro Colombians have been subjected to since their arrival of slavery. In 1999, the National Association of Displaced Afro Colombians, known as NADAC, was formed to both highlight the plight of Afro Colombian displacement from their ancestral lands and to fight against such displacement. Francia Elena Marquez Mina, the Vice President of Colombia, was once the victim of displacement from the village of La Toma. Fellow environmentalist and human rights campaigner Danelli Estupiñán Valencia was also displaced from her hometown Buenaventura, which is in the Coco Valley, on the west coast of Colombia. Like many other women of African descent, Francia and Danelli were forced to leave and move to Cali, Colombia's second largest city. Danelli has a Facebook page, but unsurprisingly there is scant information to be found there because of the many death threats she has received. The land, environment, animal and human life are central to her philosophy. On YouTube, Danelli tells the world, "The territory is everything. Without it, there is no life, because it is a source of life itself." Danelli is an extraordinary brave black woman who provides an impassioned defense of the Pacific Ocean as one of what she calls the 5 lungs of the world. The video that she makes is titled, "Why Do They Want to Kill Us?" and she speaks of the orders that have been given to murder her. Danelli is a human rights defender, and in Colombia, that is probably one of the most dangerous works anyone can do. On NADAC's website, you can find a link to the Inter-Ethnic Alliance for Peace that covers many areas such as food production to women's rights. You'll find a picture of a megaphone with the words, "The Voice of the Alliance for Peace in the Regions," next to it, signifying the internet technology as a communication tool that allows ethnic communities and external media to be aware of the actions carried out within the framework of the Inter-Ethnic Alliance for Peace, as NADAC says. The third group in this story is the story of the campesinos, the peasants, who live a hard and often dangerous life in Colombia for no other reason than simply existing. There is no colour or ethnic barrier to be a campesino. It doesn't discriminate, except it is reserved only for the poor. The song Campesino hasta morir deliciously conveys everything you need to know about the life of rural peasants in a succinct way. It is a song about traditions, culture, hardship, struggle in the face of adversity and land rights. But more importantly, it is a song about how the campesinos believe the land is their gift, received and given to be loved, cherished, protective and productive. And here's a small extract from that song. I come from the countryside. I am a peasant until I die. That was God's gift that he left for me, for my feelings. The Inter-Ecclesiastical Commission for Justice and Peace, the CIJP, is an NGO promoting the rights of Afro Colombians, indigenous people, and the mestizo peasants. The mestizo are a mixed people of indigenous and Spanish descent. The CIJP was founded in 1988 under the leadership of a radical Jesuit, Javier Giraldo Moreno, who was inspired by Jorge Camilo Torres Restrepo, a Catholic priest who joined the revolutionary Marxist organization, the National Liberation Front, the ELN. The ELN was founded in 1964 by Fabio Vázquez Castellano, who died as recently as 2019 in Havana. The ELN were inspired by Che Guevara and trained by the Cubans, and unlike FARC, they remain active today. Javier Giraldo, like Jorge Camilo Torres Restrepo, were motivated by liberation theology, which theorized the connection between religious scripture and the works of Karl Marx. It is a heady mix indeed of theological and revolutionary praxis that has taken Dissent to levels hitherto unknown elsewhere. Liberation theology was based on defending the oppressed and first emerged as an idea in the 1970s. Later the ideas were written in print by Gustavo Gutierrez Merino, who wrote A Theology of Liberation, History, Politics and Salvation, a seminal text that gained widespread support amongst the Catholic clergy. Rereading passages from that book still has the power to move and shock me in a positive way, with the many references to Marx. And one passage in relation to Marx on page 20, which I like very much, is this. The door was opened for science to help humankind take one more step on the road of critical thinking. It made humankind more aware of the socio-economic determinants of its ideological creations, and therefore freer and more lucid in relation to them. All the above is in the context of which the CIJP has operated within, but the radicalism, or perhaps I should say how their radicalism operates, has changed over time. Even though the ELN remain active, the CIJP operate peacefully within civil society, away from armed struggle. The CIJP, after all, work alongside the Peace Brigades International, the PBI, which was born out of the non-violent action in Canada in 1981. The PBI, however, didn't operate in Colombia until 1994, and when it did, it was the largest deployment of people up to that date due to the huge levels of violence that existed. Whilst they closed operations in other countries, in Colombia it continues to operate because of the continued violence. In 2021, CIJP sent a letter to President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, principally to remind them of the responsibilities to continue to work within the 2016 peace accord, which FARC was involved with. And this is an extract from that letter. Our black, indigenous and campesino communities live in remote parts of Colombia that for more than 40 years have lived in the midst of armed confrontation for political and social reasons. Today we continue to suffer old and new violence, persecution, torture, murder, enforced disappearance, displacement and violent dispossession of land, sexual violence, stigmatization and forced to remain silent or we will be killed. It's a new slavery. In September 2023, the International Peasants Movement organized a conference in Colombia's capital Bogotá against hunger. It is worth mentioning that the International Peasants Movement have accused the Israelis of using hunger as a weapon of war against the Palestinians in Gaza. On October 23, 2023, the group created a petition against Israeli Zionist aggression on their website calling for an unconditional cessation of hostilities, safe passage and border openings, accountability for war crimes, and the formation of international investigative committees. And they say this: since October 7th, Israel has been waging a genocide war against the Palestinian people. In this context, the group operate alongside the Union of Agricultural Work Committees, which is based in Palestine. There are many affiliated groups worldwide, with 2 in Colombia, and the first is the National Agrarian Coordinator, known as the CNA, and the other is the National Federation of Agriculture Cooperatives. As far as I can gather, only the CNA has a website and Facebook account with which communicates the group's objectives. The CNA website says that it is a peasant organisation consisting of women, fishermen, agro-miners and field workers. They have a significant presence in 22 departments across Colombia. Like the NASA, the CNA are highly critical of the prevailing economic system, stating that the crisis in food is a product of the capitalist mode of production. Their slogan is, "For the defense and recovery of the Colombian countryside, dignified life, and popular sovereignty." The CNA produce a magazine called La Cosecha, which is about the harvests they produce, but unlike the glossy Western countryside magazines that promote comfortable country living, advertising lifestyles for the wealthy, the CNA magazine is highly political. It emphasizes the collective effort of peasants, the struggle they are engaged in, the transformation of rural areas, and more. They also stress that our magazine is also a tool to strengthen grassroots organizations and the communication of peasantry. And the noun "our" clearly signifies their collective efforts. The CNA, in collaboration with the People's Congress, known as COP, are constructing what they call a house for the people. COP is a social and political movement which represents the aspirations of the campesinos as well as workers, indigenous people, Afro Colombians, women, young people and students throughout Colombia. Colombia is a difficult country for outsiders to understand, with its different groups, classes and ethnicities, and even how the social movements seek to work within civil society, but also to create a more democratic space and, more importantly, self-government outside the present structures of Colombian politics and economy. The dissenting voices and forms of radicalism that is unfolding from the oppressed in Colombia is such a liberating development after the years of armed conflict, which, although has diminished, is still present and not yet totally eradicated. There is no doubt that the indigenous, Afro Colombians and campesinos are using the internet and social media to their benefit with tremendous effect and rupturing the capitalist mode of production with their emphasis on collective production, which, to use Marx's language, has more use value than exchange value at the centre of its ethos and philosophy. One powerful example of how a collective voice and new technology, such as the Internet, has been effective in forwarding the right of presence is the adoption in 2018 by the UN's General Assembly of the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Peasants and Other People Working in Rural Areas, also known as UNDROP. LCV were the body who campaigned and were responsible for the United Nations adopting this important document on their website, and they state that UNDROP is a UN declaration on human rights that internationally recognizes peasants' rights as a political subjects and peasant struggle as well as their special relationship with Mother Earth. They have produced numerous booklets and videos explaining the policies contained in UNDROP, two of which are the right to food and to be free from hunger, and the other, food sovereignty and the collective right to a healthy environment. Other success stories of LVC is the creation of agroecology training schools. In the spirit of dissent and defiance, they express their strategy for the schools in 2 points. The first is it denounces the capitalist agribusiness model through direct struggles, land occupation, assemblies, street closings, fairs, events, etc. And the second, it promotes our peasant agriculture and builds knowledge through formal and informal courses for leaders, activists and grassroots, exchanges of agroecological experiences in all regions and biomes, farmer-to-farmer processes, and alliance with the various organisations that promote agroecology. The 3 groups I have presented here in this work, the indigenous, Afro Colombian and campesino stories of Colombia, are truly inspirational. And they are evidence that another world does exist that confronts and challenges the absolute failure of the capitalist system of economics wherever it exists. I used the Nasa people as my prime example of radical dissent for the indigenous, but there are other groups that readers can explore in the indigenous collective fight for social and environmental justice in Colombia. The Afro Colombian community have had their own specific history and prejudices to deal with, such as slavery, of a culture not indigenous to Colombia, and of being black-skinned or the other. The campesinos have also made significant advances in their collective struggle, also for social and environmental justice, and collectively they all represent a tour de force of change alongside other marginalized groups in Colombia today. These groups cross over and are intertwined. Their commonality is shared by their love of Mother Earth, to campaign against climate and environmental disaster, to nourish and live with the land, to protect and expand biodiversity, to enact agrarian land reform, to intensify seed production, to defend human rights, and resist the violence that has characterized Colombia for far too long. All these examples are clear evidence that dissent originates from the people in their close proximities, and that the internet has become an effective tool to communicate their local struggles in a far wider sense. And if there is one lesson to learn from their collective fight for justice, it is this: show no fear to fight those who would harm you. So, who am I in this story of resistance? I am Valentina, born into a poor mestizo campesino family. My mother is of indigenous descent. My father is in the direct descent of the Spaniards. Initially, indigenous women who became mestizo through forced marriage retained their language, identity, and cultural roots, but this has been long lost over time. My mother only speaks Spanish. You find this lost connection with indigenous language all over the Americas, where the Spaniards warp. I find myself conflicted because I am of mixed blood, a mestizo with a loving and caring father of Spanish blood, but we all know the differences between right and wrong, good and bad, and that we, the mestizo campesinos, will one day, along with our comrades in the indigenous, Afro Colombians, and other oppressed peoples of my country, find a new world. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.